Thank you so much.
Hello, just want to make sure that's working. Hello, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight for Dr. Sophie Lewis's lecture, What Goes Around Comes Around, Fleshy Toxicities, Return Home as Kin. My name is Jared Packard. I'm the exhibitions manager here at the Bemis Center. And before we begin, I want to draw your attention to a few fun upcoming events we have going on. This Saturday, we'll be flinging open our doors to the public for our open house, open studios. This is a moment for the Omaha community to get a peek into our upstairs, our residency spaces. And so some of our residents will have their studios open. You'll be able to have conversations with them and understand a little bit more about what goes into our residents' art practices. As part of that event, we will wrap it up at 4 o'clock after an afternoon of studio visits with a performance by our exhibiting artist, Bridget Moser. When I am through with you, there won't be anything left. I am very much looking forward to this. I hope you join us. For those of us watching us remotely, this will be streamed, so please plan on RSVPing and attending that. On March 9th, on Wednesday, we'll be hosting Public Assembly, Bodily Autonomy, Part 2. This is a moment for us to connect the themes of the exhibition to the what's happening in Omaha's social, political, and artistic landscape, and it's facilitated by two activists, artists, and community members, Denise Chapman and Jamonte Watson. And as another part of our ongoing lecture series, of which tonight is one, Deidre Cooper Owens, Slavery's Hospitality and the Extraction of the Black Body on March 17th at 7 p.m. This will also be a streamed event, so please plan on I'm looking at you joining us on Zoom. Please plan on joining us for that. And before we get into tonight's event, I just want to give a special shout out to all of our sponsors who, of course, we're very grateful for making this happen, this exhibition, and all of our wonderful programming. This is what allows us to keep everything free, which is a core of our mission here at BMS. So I'm delighted to welcome you all here online to the third lecture of our four-part series entitled Flesh It Out, the Body, Hospitality, and Their Material Entanglements. This innovative program was initiated by curator, Sylvie Fortin, as an integral part of the exhibition, I Don't Know You Like That, the Bodywork of Hospitality, and developed in collaboration with UNO Medical Humanities, Ded Kozer Center of Health Humanities, and more specifically, Steve Langan, Dr. Amy Morris, and Dr. Joseph McCaffrey, with their input of many others. These kinds of collaborations are really important for sparking interdisciplinary discourse and helping us understand our respective fields in new ways and with new eyes. So I'd also like to give a shout out to my colleagues, Davina Schreier and Alexander Hamilton, who are making tonight's events look and sound as great for those of us in person as those of us joining virtually, so thank you. Today's event will have 3 parts. It will be launched by Dr. Sophie Lewis's lecture, which will last about 50 minutes. University of Nebraska's Dr. Jean Amoura will then respond and share her insights for about 10 minutes. The last 20 minutes are reserved, for your questions, whether here or online. So for those of you joining remotely, get those fingers click in and type in your questions. We will be monitoring the chat and we'll relay those in person. For those of us also joining in person, please chat in your location where you're joining us from. It's always fun to see the spread of our attendees now that we're in kind of a virtual event age. Before I begin, I want to pass this off to Sylvie Fortin, the exhibition's curator and the lecture series convener, who will say a few words and introduce tonight's speakers. So thank you so much, Sylvie.
Thanks so much. Today, I guess I just want to thank Bemis first of all, for their support for both the exhibition and the related lecture series, which brought Dr. Lewis and Amoura to here tonight. These two projects are really curatorially ambitious. They're intellectually far-ranging and rigorous. They're logistically demanding. So that's a lot. They celebrate curiosity, risk-taking, experimentation on many, many levels. They're also built on myriad artistic conversations and creative collaborations. And again, I want to echo Jared in thanking UNO's Medical Humanities, with whom this series was both developed and is being delivered. So it's been a long collaboration that's taken many forms over many months. By joining forces, we can bring international thought leaders to Omaha while shining a light on the exemplary work of Nebraska scholars and researchers, and facilitating discourse and exchange that might not happen otherwise. Today, I'm most thankful to Dr. Lewis for her enthusiastic response to my invitation, for her interest in the exhibition and the lecture series, her desire to use this opportunity to develop a new lecture, and her trust in bringing these fresh ideas into the world with us. Thank you so much. Finally, I'd like to thank Dr. Jean Amoura for her willingness to step outside usual professional arena and into the art world. It's a big jump. Thank you for doing that with us, to share your knowledge, your experience, your passion with us by serving as a respondent. So I really look forward to lively conversation after the talk. Dr. Sophie Lewis is a visiting scholar at the Alice Paul Center for Research on Gender, Sexuality, and Women at the University of Pennsylvania, and a member of the teaching faculty of the Philadelphia branch of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. She's the author of Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against the Family, which was published by Verso in 2019. It's an amazing book. Everyone has to read it, which Donna Haraway has hailed as the seriously radical cry for full gestational justice that I long for. Her non-academic writing has appears frequently in numerous venues, including the New York Times, The Nation, eFlux, The New Inquiry, Jacobin, and her Patreon. Keep an eye out for Sophie's forthcoming pamphlet on family abolition, which will be called Beyond the Family, The Case for Abolition, and will be released by Verso this year in 2022. Dr. Jean Amoura is professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Nebraska and director of Nebraska Medicine's Early Pregnancy Assessment Clinic and the Gender Care Clinic. She received her medical degree from the University of Nebraska, completed OBGYN residency at the University of Michigan, and earned a master's degree in reproductive and sexual health research from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So she's exceptionally well suited for today's conversation. She's worked with hundreds of gender diverse patients of all ages through their transition. She also has a clinical focus on family planning, early pregnancy loss, and complex contraception, with additional attention to advancing medical education on these topics. So, welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hello. Thank you so much, Sylvie, and thank you, Jared, and thank you, Jean, and thank you, Bemis, and thank you for bringing me sort of out of my hermetic condition into a real life context. I'm so excited to be in Omaha, truly. So, yeah, I might just briefly clarify that we've changed the name of our center to Research in Feminist, Queer and Transgender Studies. The website still says both. In any case, thank you for introducing me so generously. I'm just going to launch in, and as Sylvie said, it's kind of new stuff, and I was promised a kind of safe space, which I can feel already is the case. The phrase, "we are here because you were there," is an old commonplace of immigrant-led anti-imperialist politics. It's a basic analysis of the reason why former subjects of empire might be resident in an inhospitable metropole. To paraphrase, we live among you now because before you came and colonized us. But why would such an explanation be necessary? Because, of course, the speakers are finding themselves unwelcome, interpolated by the you of the slogan into a them rather than an us. The slogan addresses the autochthonous authority that views the speakers as aliens, as uninvited guests, whose presence needs to be accounted for according to the rules of the dominant culture, rather than greeted as in other societies' ancient traditions, including ancient Greece with xenia and all of this, or treated to the special hospitality due to the stranger. If I'm going to permit myself to editorialize very briefly, when editors pre-COVID didn't really have a lot of time for my wild-eyed family abolitionist ravings, a couple of weeks of lockdown really changed their mind on that. And it was proposed that I might do some kind of op-ed on the possibilities COVID affords for, quote unquote, treating everyone like family. And I suggested that perhaps it's a good opportunity to learn to treat everyone as a stranger. And I guess there's a sort of sensibility, informed by that utopian inversion in this talk as well. So to explain why one is here becomes necessary when hospitality is withheld, when one is faced with xenophobic sentiments, such as go home, go back to where you come from, and so on. Listen, one ends up protesting in self-justification. Don't be surprised, tolerate us. Our lives in this location are actually caused by something you did. The implication being that, were that not the case, we might not be here at all. Perhaps even that we definitely wouldn't be here in this trumped up shithole had we had more choice in the matter. Or to pursue that vein even further, perhaps we are here in the same way that you were there. In other words, we are here to extract and subjugate, which is the very real fantasy of Islamophobic xenophobes throughout Europe who talk about colonization and invasion and Sharia law. Our immigration to the so-called core from the so-called periphery, this slogan perhaps implies, could be a kind of counter-colonization, a karmic cycle of history at least, or perhaps a form of vengeance. The phrase "we are here because you were there," at minimum, rings out as a reminder that Europe was built by the rest of the world, that you are still here, Western man, simply because we were. So as I'm hopefully making clear, and perhaps belaboring the point a little too long, and as Amber Doe's artwork by the same name evokes, it is a deceptively complex slogan. On one level, it appears to be ceding to the terms of a neo-colonial order, almost pleading not to be held responsible for the trespass that is actually history's fault. And on another level, in its rather conspicuous explanatory insufficiency vis-a-vis a question that makes very little sense, it casts doubt on the validity of its own premise. So it thus points beyond itself, shaming the subject of xenophobia it appears to want to appease. So why would you want to question anyone's freedom to be here simply because they want to be, or indeed, to be here for no reason at all? Why do you feel entitled to an account of why someone is in your home? Indeed, given the lethal character of the colonial enterprise throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, isn't it more apt to say, we are here despite the fact that you were there, where I am from? Let's get back to basics for a second. Where do people come from? I find it kind of hilarious to be posing this question in a scholarly and artistic setting, as opposed to an intimate conversation explaining the birds and the bees to a very young person. But sometimes the most basic things are precisely what we need to re-narrativize. So, listen, children. People come from the bodies of other people. People whose molecules are basically the same molecules as those of our fetal selves. Via the protection against full-blown invasion afforded to her by the hemicorial placenta, pictured here, isn't it intense. It's a really brutal apparatus. It really locks everything inside your anatomy down. Via the protection afforded by this apparatus, the uterus haver works metabolically in order to make more human flesh. She builds fetal eyeballs, fetal bone tissue, and so on. And just to dwell on this for a moment, the molecules are the same molecules as the uterus haver's molecules. Where else would they have appeared from? Gestator and gestatee are always genetically completely different, yet at the same time made of the same blood and guts. That's a really interesting contradiction. In other words, if the bodies are not one, they certainly are not two. Or perhaps if the body isn't quite two, it also isn't one. Chikako Takeshita has proposed a noun for grasping this situation: the mother fetus. Takeshita offers an alternative ontology of the pregnant body, one which collapses the material distinction between the maternal and the fetal and insists that we must learn to think the mother fetus holobiont as a boundary-breaching cyborg figure engaged in symbiotic, right, reciprocal, and symbiogenetic becoming with co-production. A lot of long academic words, but hopefully I'm breaking them down for you and making them a bit less scary. Takeshita's intervention is salutary because when it comes to moving beyond the discursive gridlock whereby feminists have sought, decade on decade, to fight a more than human liberation struggle on humanist terrain, I'll take any kind of tool or suggestion. I kind of like mother fetus. So perhaps you've already heard this 1,000 times. It's certainly a favorite feminist talking point in some areas of academia about the etymology of the word individual. The etymology excludes the female, defined according to reproductive capacity by its very definition, because the core concept in the word is indivisibility, and it was explicitly intended to exclude uterus bearing, i.e. potentially multiple and thus divisible anatomy from its purview. So that means the individual who gets to make claims like my body, my choice is by definition not a pregnant person, or the pregnant person is by definition not an individual. When Black and white and indigenous feminists the world over started saying my body, my choice, be it in reference to forced sterilization or access to abortion or the right to gender-affirming healthcare or freedom of sexuality, they were strategically invoking the liberal humanist premise of property in the body. And to some extent, it worked. Although reactionary and anti-feminist deployments of the same biopolitical claim, my body, my choice, towards deeply anti-social ends have always been co-present. Naturally, one standard feminist response to the eye-opening anti-gestational etymology of the whole concept of individualism is to simply refute, right? Nonsense. Of course she's an individual. Like, of course. And I like, don't contest that exactly. Like the vast majority of feminists, I have tended to agree with this as a strategic move, or at least a tactical one, in the sense that individualist body sovereignty principles and, as I mentioned, property in the body discourses are what reproductive rights, justice, and freedom activists have had available to them, or what we have had available to us, what we have had so far in capitalist societies. And for the purposes of making that case that no one should be pregnant against their will, not even for the smallest amount of time, this kind of property in the body discourse can serve us. According to the standard feminist pro-choice framing, the divisible person must be empowered at all costs to become indivisible again, right? That's to say, individual again, if she wishes. After all, some of the components of the mother fetus are much more equal than others. One of them is a person. whereas the other is a proto-person. Both are attached, albeit asymmetrically, to this aggressively extractive and protective apparatus that mediates between, but which is geared to preserve the life of the fetus over the life of the gestator when push comes to shove. Any reason and no reason at all are thus good enough reason to pull the plug, especially given how threatening the apparatus is to the adult's health and even her life, right? 300,000 people a year die of during pregnancy. Just, yeah, blows my mind. No doubt about it, ethically, what the pregnant person wants goes. So I actually agree with the fascist proponents of forced gestation that ethical consideration towards fetuses should be on our list of things to tend to at some point. I want to get to a place where giving fetuses ethical consideration has become viable, right? But at least until the day when gestating is a lot less dangerously invasive of a process for a body to undertake, and or until the day that it can be partially, perhaps, automated or handed off to a third party for a spell, what a fetus wants is really completely immaterial. As I say, this is my position politically. Abortions are a public good, not a necessary evil. However, I'm curious, besides sovereign individualism, are there other ways of getting to that conclusion? Other response strategies may be worth entertaining in the face of the assertion that a pregnant person is not an individual. What if, experimentally, when the fascist proponents of forced gestation say, "Is it really just your body?" we allowed it? What if experimentally we said, "You know, you're completely right. A body does not have two hands, excuse me, two heads, four hands, four legs, two beating hearts, and two different sets of DNA. A body has so many more things than that." What if we contemplated saying, okay, so be it, the pregnant person is not an individual, and we asked ourselves instead, so what is she then? And nota bene, perhaps she is not a she at all. A holobiont, a cyborg, is the answer again for Takashita, or say Astrida Neymanis, author of Bodies of Water, or Donna Haraway. How can we think a collective feminist subject in reference to such a being? A majority of Marxists, much to my chagrin, have not always been willing to try. But remember, the putatively non-pregnant among us really shouldn't be at all confident that we aren't also pretty divisible, you know, deconstructible, for instance, into myriad symbiotic populations of beings with distinct DNA, bacterial cultures, microorganisms, and so on. Microchimerism, for example, is the scientific term for the cross-colonization that takes place in, you know, literal pregnancy, the production process whence we all originate, whereupon pieces of the DNA of the fetus are left behind and sort of float around the adult's body for the rest of their life, and vice versa. Pieces of the gestator's DNA sort of then co-comprise the born one in perpetuity. Basically, babies, once they've emerged from someone's abdomen, are at once drastically helpless, unfinished, and new, and kind of old, and already damaged and riddled with the fumes of history. So that's in brief where people come from and how. One word for the creative process involved is anthrogenesis, the making of the human. And as I've hopefully evoked, when one starts to track the trails of anthrogenesis across the earth, it becomes hard to limit its purview to persons presenting with literal placentas. As you may already know, I've long been interested in the agonism of anthrogenesis. I've written again and again about this sort of too infrequently discussed ripping and tearing and fighting that goes along with the biology of hospitality, of generosity, of love that happens during placentation and parturition. in our species. And I'm, pretty obsessed, I think, still today. I'm glad that Sylvie invited me to think again, to think about new things in connection with it, because I think there's heuristically generative boundary trouble that tells us something about bodily xenohospitality, right? Which is to say, hospitality toward the alien. To an extent, as I wrote in the final chapter of Full Surrogacy Now, bodies are always leaky, parasited, and non-unitary. It can sound sort of too easy to say that, really. And it can become a romantic reflection, as though it's pleasant or pretty. The vital and varied flora of bacteria that swirl through and between every body, not just gestating ones, makes a mockery of bodily autonomy, even outside of pandemics, which is not, of course, to say that bodily autonomy isn't paradoxically at the same time a really important principle. Again, dialectics. In the accounts of earthly life given by biologists such as Lynn Margulis, we are all revealed to be disconcertingly pregnant. That is, sort of multiply pregnant with myriad beings, some of whom are even simultaneously gestating us back, which is to say, providing some crucial developmental functions on our behalf. But speaking of symbiogenesis, having discovered the work of Patricia Piccinini via my teen idol Donna Haraway's essay on it in 2011, that's an essay called Speculative Fabulations for Technoculture's Generations. I've looked back to these surrogates, helpers, carriers, and gestators in Piccinini's oeuvre again and again as haptic meditations on xenohospitality and xenosolidarity, solidarity and hospitality vis-a-vis the alien. They're not, I think, utopian visions, or if they are, they're sort of critical utopias. For one thing, the hyperreal human beings in Piccinini's surrogate series are typically white, a whiteness that the equally hyperreal pink skin of the cyborg creatures highlights rather uncannily. The human's vulnerabilities are being tended to by these stoical, albeit sometimes faintly threatening, pseudo-white non-human companions in what appears like a one-way flow. The mutants who are holding and nourishing the human seems unthanked, unacknowledged, even unseen. Perhaps in Piccinini's settler colonial Australian context, the labors of species contaminating care and kinship practices that are, represented here, benefiting white people, are undeserved, right? Certainly unreciprocated. But I also don't think Piccinini is saying anything as simple as, that's not okay. After all, care is never symmetrical, nor need it necessarily strive to be. However, as I read it, there is an incitement here to cultivate class consciousness, a sadly outmoded phrase, which perhaps can be recoded as transnationalist, multi-species, proletarian responsibility. Yes, Haraway spells it that way, response-ability, i.e. the ability to respond ongoingly to the far-flung intimacies of distributed reproduction. Ways must be found ongoingly to rub our reluctant faces in the continuities between the biomes and flesh worlds that centuries of capitalist ecology have sapped, disabled, and rendered toxic, and the bodies that settlers especially like to think of as our own neatly bounded family trees. Like Donna Haraway's socialist 1985 cyborg, my title, Full Surrogacy Now, was both descriptive and prescriptive. It's both utopian and dystopian. Descriptively, it refers to a reality that is already here, which is that we are all very much the makers of one another. Or, in the other case, we are all non-innocent cyborgs, whether we like it or not. And at the same time, again, like the cyborg, it is a manifesto, a prescription that we have to collectively recognize that we are the makers of one another and that we are each other's harvest and learn to act like it. The practical collective skills to be cultivated towards that end as a matter of urgency could be called, in my other proposed coinage, amniotechnics. Amniotechnics is the art of holding and caring even while being ripped into, at the same time as being held. It is protecting water and protecting people from water, recognizing that we are made not so much underwater as in water, being water ourselves, so water in water. Our wateriness is our surrogacy. It's the bed of our bodies' overlap. And it is, not necessarily but possibly, a source of radical kinship. The art of caring for water in full recognition of its death-dealing inhumanity and its unromantic necessariness to life. Full recognition that it is a kind of frenemy within is one aspect of the art of living on a damaged planet, in my opinion, to recall Anna Tsing's phrase. In After Fukushima, Jean-Luc Nancy writes about the catastrophe of meaning to which humanity collectively is being exposed in the wake of continued, combined and uneven ecocide. Let us remain exposed, he suggests provocatively, and let us think about what is happening to us, ce qui nous arrive. Let us think that it is we who are arriving or are leaving. If the Anthropocene calls us to imagine humanity written into the rock of the earth itself, capitalism is the instrument of this brutal inscription. For it is not the products of humanity that will come to be stratified, but the externalities of Monsanto and DuPont. Okay, so first off, it is we who are arriving or leaving seems to me to be a promising modification of the terms of the encounter with Xenos, the stranger, which we looked at in the beginning, whereby the firmly rooted citizen rejects the ancient imperative of Xenia and considers herself just not implicated, not a part of the coming and going of immigrants who are here, because she, in a sense, was there. In the ecocidal moment in which so much of Earth is becoming uninhabitable, in other words, perhaps our leaving and arriving will always and henceforward be mutual, or it will not be. All borders of nation states closed to migrants must self-evidently be opened, given the uneven yet radically combined character of climate catastrophe. But there are two other things in Nancy's reflection here that jump out at me. The phrase products of humanity and the word stratified. Stratified reproduction is a phrase advanced by the anthropologist Shelley Colin, author of The Global Politics of Reproduction, in order to capture what baby making essentially is in a class society. In essence, it is structured like a layer cake made up of discrete strata with all the cream reserved for the mothers, babes, and infants of the upper crust. In Jean-Luc Nancy's usage here, of course, stratification is referring to the buildup of rock and fossil. Formations he is perhaps suggesting will henceforward be interspersed with substances like the plastiglomerate rock that the queer science scholar Heather Davis thinks with in her book Plastic Matter. A millefeuille layering of chemical history, which Nancy is saying is being written not by humans, but by capital. And I totally get why Nancy wants to say that we are living in the capitalocene, not the Anthropocene. For instance, because large swathes of indigenous humanity have had little role in geoengineering planet Earth beyond human habitability. I'm not really defending the Anthropocene, to be clear, but I can't accept that the products of humanity can be clearly separated from the externalities of the vast multinational chemical, technoscience, and fossil fuel conglomerates. I understand the logic behind separating out that which humans seek to make and that which capital wreaks and makes us make. But separating these two things is nevertheless impossible. When the labor power we sell congeals into commodities, it leaves its trace on the effluents in the tailing ponds, leaching into the groundwater, and then ultimately, for Nancy, the fossil record of the planet. And that's just directly market-mediated labor. As a feminist, influenced both by Haraway's cyborgicity thesis and by the social factory thesis of the unorthodox autonomia Marxists and wages against housework militants of Italy in the early 70s, I want to understand the materiality of social reproduction to be part of those same circuits of valorization as is wage commodity production. The phrase social reproduction, by the way, basically means the same thing as anthrogenesis, in the specific sense of making and remaking human life in the service of the perpetuation of markets. A quick note in case of lack of familiarity about this group, Wages for Housework. Wages for Housework, also known as Wages Against Housework, was a utopianist platform that issued directional demands for money and time, with a view to one day doing away entirely with both wages and housework. And these women advanced, among other things, that, quote, every miscarriage is a workplace accident, because every pregnancy, paid or unpaid, is a job. And they grappled with the fact that unpaid childbearing and housework is productive for capitalism. The insidiousness of the problem is precisely that the family, for example, is simultaneously workplace and haven. We have to try to be dialectical about it. Social reproduction activities, such as caring, are often a major, if not paramount, source of satisfaction in this world, even as they are simultaneously value-producing labors that are being hollowed out from under us and stolen from us by the hydra-headed system of endless accumulation, right? So this opposition Nancy is making between the products of humanity and the traces of Monsanto and DuPont, I think that's a wishful dichotomy, unfortunately. And I take that same exact insight, by the way, from the Cyborg Manifesto, right? The cyborg is a non-innocent figure of collective liberation, Haraway told us. Careful, she kept saying, not to romanticize this. The cyborg is born as the cyborg enemy, and the death-dealing machine, in a sense, is us. It's a really difficult thing to think with, at least for the time being, and certainly for the foreseeable. The death-dealing machine is partly working through us. That's not to say we can't also work against it, but there's no purity in sight. The flesh of our loved ones is densely scribbled on by capitalist metabolism, toxicants, carcinogens, endocrine disruptors, plastics. We must let go of our normative attachments to the ideal of undamaged life. As crip theory and science and technology studies and queer environmental humanities scholars like Heather Davis are increasingly teaching us, humanity and humanities products are objectively not separate, if they ever were, from the processes of laying waste and destructive productivity that Nancy indexes there with those words, Monsanto, DuPont. Our adult and neonatal bodies alike are full of microplastics. Many types of plastic directly inhibit the human ability to reproduce procreatively, but on account of its own almost infinite longevity, Davis proposes plastic should perhaps in and of itself be understood as a non-filial human progeny, a kind of bastard child that will most certainly outlive us. How do we care for plastic offspring? And how do we care for the many poisoned mothers of humanity's products and capital's byproducts? In 2014, I watched a talk by the feminist neuroscience scholar Deboleena Roy on YouTube. And it's a piece of research I mentioned briefly in Full Surrogacy Now. But as you can see, I almost never forgot it, and I remain fascinated. I am really grateful to Sylvie for sponsoring and offering me this opportunity in which to revisit that unforgettable talk and to begin a little thinking along with the analysis Deboleena Roy offered. Okay, so entitled Germline Ruptures, Methyl Isocyanate Gas and the Transpositions of Life, Death and Matter in Bhopal, Roy's talk pointed to a uniquely poignant aspect of the ongoing fallout from what is commonly accepted as the world's worst industrial disaster. And it's an aspect that immediately suggested to me the phrase, what goes around comes around. Because as Sharmila Rudrappa has also shown, populations in India that were targeted for reproductive desistance via sterilization, Planned Parenthood education, and indeed environmentally racist chemical, architectural, and urban planning decisions, in a gruesome twist of history, all too often, those very same populations become those targeted precisely to have babies, right? And their reproductive capacities are harnessed for domestic purchase and also chiefly for export. So the medical tourism, including especially reproductive tourism industry, has been promoted intensively by the Indian government for outside investment. And while surrogacy itself is currently illegal in India, many of the other component parts of reproductive assistance, as it's called, which I always bracket in my mind with this kind of objection, as though any reproduction could be unassisted, are still very much in place, right? Those industries of medical outsourcing. So the possibility remains, despite the surrogacy being banned right now, that toxicant affected surro-babies have returned a modicum of methyl isocyanate mediated flesh sort of back to America, where Union Carbide was founded, in a kind of loop of queer poetic justice. We are here because you were there. But before I go on, I do want to just refresh our collective memories about the Bhopal disaster. The tragedy in question, which occurred in early December 1984, consisted of a gargantuan explosion of methyl isocyanate, which is also known as carbaryl, and can be sort of shorthanded MIC, from the Union Carbide pesticide plant in Madhya Pradesh. And the plant manufactured Temic and Sevin, which were popular brands of carbamate pesticides of the type that began to be used in the 1950s and 60s Green Revolution in agriculture. These are organic compounds that kill insects by attacking their brains and nervous systems. According to best estimates, when a large quantity of tank cleaning water was accidentally poured into the container full of methyl isocyanate at the plant, the heat-generating chemical reaction that was triggered killed 20,000 human beings, either instantly or in the initial 2 to 3 months of the aftermath. But even that number fails to convey the fact that the tragedy is still, to this day, actively unfolding, with the uncleaned up pollution still meeting myriad forms of slow violence out to hundreds of thousands more people via groundwater and food production, but also via bodies themselves in the form of heritable nervous, respiratory, and reproductive toxicities. There are protests all the time. They haven't stopped. It's been almost 40 years. Union Carbide, by the way, was bought out by Dow Chemical 15 years later. Many lifelong activist survivors have called not only for Union Carbide and then Dow Chemical to compensate and clean up, but also for funding and for ongoing scientific research, reproductive monitoring, genetic screening of the victims and their families. No responsibility by either Union Carbide or Dow Chemical was ever forthcoming. Although I wonder if any of you caught this moment where the hoax activist group, the Yes Men, managed to convince the BBC that one of them was a legitimate spokesperson for Dow Chemical and was actually filmed and then broadcast twice before the clip was taken down, speaking as Dow, apologizing for the tragedy and taking full responsibility and promising $50 billion in reparations, which I have to say is one of my favorite theatrical détournement moments of that genre, and it was a real coup for them. And some people attacked them, saying that they had raised false hope for the people in Bhopal who had sort of, been fighting for this, and for a couple of hours had thought that they were receiving, billions of dollars. But if you're interested in that angle, there's, I think, a very persuasive documentary that the two yes men did, following up, traveling amongst all the sort of reproductive justice clinics and survivor-led organizations in the area, where a lot of people just laugh at the idea that they had given them false hope and that they shouldn't have done it. There's some really moving quotes from people who say, we've been fighting for this for 30 years. When you're in hell and you think you're in heaven for 2 hours, you just thank the people who put you in heaven, even if it was only for 2 hours. And Dow, in response to that, simply denied that the press release was legitimate, which you'd hope would have some kind of effect. Denying, that you're giving 50. In any case, I should move on. Survivors have called ongoingly for scientific research, reproductive monitoring, genetic screening of the victims and their families. As I say, 4 days after the tragedy, the company's chairman, Warren Anderson, was arrested under the order of the Indian government upon arriving in Madhya Pradesh. But after being held under house arrest for only a few hours, Anderson posted bail and quickly left the country, never returning to face trial. He gets burned in effigy a lot. Actually, no, I think this is him, and this is the current Dow CEO. And Dow is a company that, I kid you not, has recently been hailed as woke by virtue of having a gay CEO. Deboleena Roy drew on a broad range of scientific evidence claiming that MIC and its metabolites have left their mark and continue to interact with the hormones, tissues, DNA, both somatic and gametic, and the reproductive activity of the Bhopali population. As is quasi-invariably the case within the logic of surplus life and environmental racism, the impact was class differentiated. This is horrible. Those who were able to escape the deadly fumes by car were found to have better survival rates and fewer long-term health repercussions. Those without vehicles who attempted to flee on foot breathed in the toxic air and suffered much more heavily. In a gruesome anti-reproductive futurity twist, the toxic gas, which was heavier than the surrounding air, settled close to the ground in the wake of the explosion, exposing small children to the very highest concentrations. Women who were pregnant at the time of the leak experienced miscarriages at 10 times higher than the normal population. A 2009 review of clinical and experimental findings, Roy explains, finds that there are all kinds of menstrual abnormalities, vaginal discharge, and premature menopause issues that have emerged as common symptoms among MIC-exposed women and their female offspring. Most interestingly, she's looking at these vertical transmissions and epigenetic impacts of MIC exposure via gestation on future generations. All in all, Roy proposes, MIC is transforming life in intergenerational time. But while there's no question about pursuing reparations from the firms and governments, both Indian and transnational, right, whose negligence made this massacre, given the role of carbamate pesticides like Sevin and Temic products in the Green Revolution, Roy suggests that we should actually understand what she's calling MIC-mediated reproduction as having begun long before the 1984 industrial catastrophe. So the catastrophe becomes something that makes something already happening more visible. You've probably heard by now that living human fetuses, conceptualized as genetically authored private property, are, one of the many commodities whose manufacture can be outsourced to the global south. Gestational workers typically belong to structurally adjusted proletarian geographies, and that includes Eastern Europe. They stand fairly low on caste hierarchies throughout Southeast Asia, and they hail from populations often classified as surplus to capital's requirements. Contract pregnancy gigs are presented to them by recruiters as opportunities to exit the misery of their class, and also, very normatively, to buy a house to raise their own children in. They do not contribute eggs, only supposedly muscle, and their job in general is quite inadequately protected, both in family and labor law, locally and transnationally. The so-called intended parents, on their part, are typically from the middle and upper classes of the same country as the surrogate, or else the lower middle classes and up of overdeveloped nations, such as ours. After the industry-recommended caesarean section that produces their commissioned offspring, these parents rarely continue. They very rarely continue whatever nominal relationship they were conducting remotely with their carrier during the 8 months prior. The genetic blueprint of your desired fetuses, clients are insistently invited to imagine by the clinicians who are taking their money, is what counts, right? Pretty much exclusively in terms of the authorship of the babies. It's your data in that little chip, if you like, that counts. And it has been provided according to your own design prior to being transferred in embryo form into an in vivo environment that is essentially a holding place, not a craft workshop. Gestational labor, framed as passive and uncreative in this way, has been hireable now for a couple of decades in an ever-shifting constellation of national legislatures. And it's in particular, as you probably know, these places that where outsourcing gets concentrated for all kinds of other industries, and for a fraction of what it costs to hire a commercial American or, say, a Ukrainian surrogate. Speaking of which, Ukrainian surrogacy workplaces are very much in the news right this second. And the coverage has reminded me of the grisly realities revealed in the Nepal earthquake in 2015, during which catastrophe the Israeli government sent in airlift support, but exclusively for its own citizens on Nepali territory. And that category, Israeli citizens, included the fetuses owned by Israeli commissioning couples that had, perhaps only just exited the bodies of Nepali surrogates, or even still inside the bodies, but not the surrogates themselves. They were not airlifted. Or if they were airlifted, they were reportedly denied visas to Israel, while they and their precious cargo were temporarily held in Israeli hospitals. As the socialist writer Belen Fernandez crisply remarked, this action demonstrated that fetuses that have been gestated in Nepal and are often the offspring of a non-Jewish mother and carried by a non-Jewish surrogate could claim a birthright to the self-appointed Jewish state, while Palestinians literally born on that land cannot. The contract pregnancy industry makes all kinds of amazing claims about how manufacturing new human beings works, which is why I troubled you with my own counter-narrative. surrogacy clinicians and reproductive capitalists claim that the form-giving fire of willing proletarians' bodies the world over can be sort of cleanly borrowed for the purposes of baby making via discrete exchanges that leave behind them no ghostly trail, no trace of their maker. In other words, gestational labor can be temporarily hired on genuinely finite contracts, no more consequential to one's kinship, metaphysics, or one's sense of identity than a one-off understanding with a pet sitter off TaskRabbit. Indeed, part of the ontological framing that makes the brokerage of these rentals possible is a promise that as long as the genetic material of the would-be author or authors of a baby is successfully formatted into a zygote and presented for transfer, an impersonal uterine muscle will hygienically set about actualizing the design. Like an artist who barely touches the artwork she is officially authoring because she has a team of craftspeople and builders to do that for her. The intended procreator is reassured. Whoever the gestational muscle is part of will not, repeat, not, leave the sticky filaments of her identity anywhere on the finished living product. The surrogate will have no more claim on that product than an egg cup does over its boiled egg. The baby will not be her kin. So you can perhaps see where I'm trying to go with this, if you'll pardon me, embryonic project. The Bhopal disaster and its huge concentration of MIC poisoning provides this very sort of vivid node of a moment of toxic reproductive stratification. But whereas comparable gas disasters on American soil were cleaned up, such that American children could continue to be born, Bhopali life was left to suffocate, weep, there were all these ocular problems, suffer infertility, and mutate. Sorry, there was a but there that didn't belong there. That is the stratification, right? But the stratification might be turning out to be fairly liquid and leaky after all, sort of failing to stay in its proper place. If indeed gestational surrogates have, as they most certainly have, been commissioned by parents from America to gestate American embryos, which then traveled to America upon being born, sort of full of Bhopali blood and guts. Failing to stay in one's proper place is in fact exactly what gestational surrogates are accused of in the anxious imaginary of surrogacy service consumers. In Full Surrogacy Now, I focused on one surrogacy capitalist's assurance that, and I quote, her employee surrogates will not come knocking, unquote, on the doors of the homes in the global north. And I used that in order to reflect on what it would mean for gestational laborers to perhaps be empowered to do just that and come knocking on the doors either of real homes or of proprietarian kinship models. And when we were talking before this lecture, Jean told me about a kind of fantasy of adoption models that might involve not just a child, but perhaps a sort of mother-child dyad, or you know, perhaps some more. Just to sort of restate what Deboleena Roy says in this paper on germline ruptures, as she calls it, and transpositions of life and death mediated by MIC via gas disaster on the one hand and a baby-making industry on the other. She's sort of proposing tracing, quote, the breaking down of Bhopali survivors' reproductive bodies, their genetics and their liquids due to MIC exposure, and simultaneously examining the building up of new fetal bodies through the genetics and liquids provided by Bhopali surrogates. And I just wanted to quote that because it's got so many liquids in it, and it reminds me that it was simple water that triggered the MIC gas holocaust. Amniotechnics is no laughing matter. It isn't easy. and it's a matter of life or death, whether it creates conditions of flourishing or drowns your kin. If chickens come home to roost, then during the transnational Indian surrogacy boom, Bhopali MIC made its way home via the bodies of surro-babies commissioned by Americans. Can this circuit of historic molecular violence, whereby toxicity is returned to its place of origin through the labors of gestating Indian bodies, tell us something about the vengeful dimensions of hospitality and the cunning of a botched amniotechnics? Is Jean-Luc Nancy right that we must endeavor to stay exposed? I recognize that this basically brings us just back to the question that I proposed to you in my talk description. But sometimes I guess it's better to spend a lot of time getting a grip on one's question rather than venturing a premature set of conclusions. The story of the toxic surro-babies and the sort of planetary loop that they travel evokes for me a sensibility of responsibility and parentality and transgenerational enmeshment vis-a-vis a sort of motley and multitudinous crew of poisoned reproductive service workers, living and dead. I am not sure that kinship is a strong enough category for the practices of xeno-hospitality and xeno-solidarity that are so urgently needed for us to live across the rifts of this damaged earth. And I hope we can learn to treat each other like strangers. That's what I say in the last chapter of this book. Thank you.
Oh, Sophie, it's so amazing. I've just got so many thoughts sort of swirling around for me. I'm going to focus in on what strikes me, I think the most is that this coming around to a man-made disaster seeming to possibly have a great chance for, being potentially an opening into a reckoning with this kind of practice. And it does just seem like, in even a broader sense, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, just as far as the idea of climate damage more generally, of man-made climate damage as being having the greatest potential for humans to start caring about people in distant places, because it all is going around and coming around. And this is such, like, on this very small and personal scale of a baby being made elsewhere. I mean, it is heartbreaking to me that even as you're outlining it, if not for the fact of these women serving as surrogates, this now would be unlikely. I mean, I think that's what draws the attention of the West back to it, is, oh no, this is coming right back to us. And where is their worth in its own right? Not as having any relation. So I don't know, I'm just curious of your thoughts on there's the heartbreak of it, but also the potential advantage of that globalization piece actually being an impetus for drawing attention to damage that we contribute to around the world. Yeah.
didn't know whether you were going to talk more and I should build up questions or whether I should respond
Oh.
now.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
I'll keep asking questions.
Yeah, I think that's a really good tension that you're identifying. Yeah, I think it's always got this kind of dual valence. I know what you mean, the story of sort of things becoming, you know, attention worthy again because of a startling, you know, effect, an intimate, you know, repercussion on the sort of centers of power culturally. I mean, on the other hand, I'm actually not sure that this, you know, this possibility that the surrogacy industry might be sort of commissioning parents, you know, radioactive babies. I mean, I shouldn't use words imprecisely like that, but you know, the idea seems to me to be, the idea that that would be covered is radioactive, because there is quite a lot invested in the industry, you know, guaranteeing its provision of, you know, cleanly realized progeny to its clients. So while, you know, while there are these stories about airlifts out of, you know, earthquake zones and, you know, melodramas about Ukrainian surrogacy clinics, I actually haven't seen a lot of attention to this piece that Deboleena Roy is talking about. I guess you're also making me think about the duality of that production, right? Global North, global South. Like I was saying, you know, you are actually here because we were there. It's bi-directional, right? And when I think about Patricia Piccinini's, you know, surrogate series, I sometimes wonder to myself whether she could do the other direction, you know, the plastic children being sort of nurtured by the humans. Actually, I think she does do a few that are along those lines. I can think of one that is sort of a simian who is kind of cradling what looks like a sort of double-ended foot. But do you know what I mean? There's sort of, but there's something quite, there's always something a little, there's a tension of some sort of symbiogenesis in her pairings, you know?
Right.
And I think sometimes she's purposely playing on that alarm that parents who think of their kids as their sort of exclusive property might feel if there was indeed this kind of naked wombat in Jimmy's cot, you know, spooning him.
Right.
Like, it's an alarming idea. And I think she's saying the wombat is there in your child's cot, in a sense. Maybe that's a bit too much extrapolating, but you know, it's the weird and the cyborg is present. The kids are avatars of this great sort of purity for no real reason. You know, they don't burst forth, you know, clean of history.
Well, I mean, the other thing that makes me think of is you were saying, conjuring up that image of that these clinics would have really the audacity to guarantee, you know, a good outcome. I mean, it's something. It's something, you know, whether people are having a completely you know, pregnancy that is conceived and carried with, you know, the lowest tech means possible. Of course, there's no guarantee. And the idea that people would imagine that to go to, cross these many steps, you're going way out of the area that you actually know. I mean, literally, physically, geographically. And through all this additional technology, in the spirit of this somehow enabling a better likelihood of a pure product at the end, is so misguided, even just in setting that out as a goal. It's remarkable. The other thing that I wanted to just touch on is I guess when we sort of try to parse out, like, I just was so taken in your talk tonight and in listening to the book just about this potential for society to have a broader concept of what parenthood, and I guess to be quite fair, probably more realistically motherhood, but if I'm being generous, I'll say parenthood, of how that broader, kind of that pluralistic idea of it might look. And it made me just think, sort of, what are the barriers to us getting there? Is it that, why have we come to this point where we have such a ownership sense, even though we know, of course, that that's not the relationship between parents and children, but is it just merely a sense of control? That if it's the smaller and smaller our families, the tighter, I guess I should say, the family is, rather than the shared sort of parenting that could go on, that does go on in some places, and that almost surely went on much more, goes on in places that don't have, I think, really the same kind of capitalist bent. But that is it the, what do you think is sort of the driving need there? To my mind, it sort of was coming up as, is it our need for kind of control again? I compare it to just our approach to, say, all sorts of social welfare that we have, and that we sacrifice in the spirit of, I'll just keep more and more, lower taxes, and I'll keep more and more, and then I can do better for my little tiny corner of the world, rather than, if we all do better, we all do better, this kind of idea. And I feel like that's that same logic gets applied to parenting of, I'm just going to pour everything into my little vessel. And I don't know if there's just that we let pride get wrapped up in it, or is it a control that I can have more control over this one individual. So anyway, I'm just curious about the kind of the grand idea of this broader parenting model, and what you think are the kind of just societal barriers for that.
Gosh, yeah. I mean, part of me, wants to sort of index that there's a very complicated history of enclosure that over many centuries that sort of generated the invention of the, private nuclear household. But, this kind of answer is going to be, well, I do have some other sort of psychological and cultural thoughts. I think, so in one sense, the family in that mode became progressively over time the organizing principle for care in society. And it's a privatization of care, right? Not everybody individually sort of willing it thus, but it becoming a form of sort of organized austerity that isn't perceived or even experienced that way because it is abundance, or the closest thing we have to that, right? It's on the individual level, right? So an individual person thinks, oh, bloody hell, I can't criticize, the family because family is all I have. And that's kind of, it's a sort of bizarre Ouroboros where, because it's all you have, it becomes all you have. Like it can only be all you have because, and I think the same thing kind of applies to relationships with children, which have been kind of almost criminalized, like in certain ways, or like, okay, that's a big word. I think there's suspicion cast on relationships with children since the 80s, where, big moral panics were sort of ginned up around the specter of the pedophile, which is a tactic of appearing to care about abuse, that in fact authorizes a lot of different kinds of abuse. And, it used to be fairly common in the late 60s and 70s to talk about how bad of a system private nuclear households are for children, because that's where the vast majority of abuse happens. And it's not just children that suffer, and not just trans children either. It's also kind of everyone and women. And it seems sort of almost shocking or weird to talk about these observations now because of the naturalization of the family as the only place you could possibly be, right, in the world. But I still kind of want to say it, that the family is where you are most likely to be raped and murdered and robbed and inflicted unwanted touch or, blackmailed. It's a too seldom discussed thing that even the police, that extremely not liberatory feminist institution, sort of knows that when a woman calls up and doesn't understand why all of her credit cards have been maxed out and her bank accounts are empty and she's been a victim of identity fraud, it's always the boyfriend or the husband, literally, apparently, always, like a vast majority. And, the police know that enough to simply have that as a policy of first, inquiry.
Right.
And I guess, I'm not trying to villainize heterosexuality per se, right? It's not like, I'm not really into that trend in a sense of kind of making out that there's no hope or pleasure or joy to be found in that domain. I think that's a strange trend that's come about, I think, among some as a young queer feminist, to sort of imply that all would be well if everyone would just sort of embrace queerness, when it's not clear whether queerness in that setting means a critique of private property, whether it means a critique of, racialization, or, there are lots of things to discuss about that. And I'm sort of going way off tangent now. But yeah, I think one of the things about the drive to go and have your own progeny made to order is in part that it is actually quite hard to have children in your life unless you go and do that. And the 80s succeeded, I think, in really privatizing not just care, which is the main thing, but also sort of social life. And I wonder if it were more, if we managed to sort of start a movement of contestation of the idea that it's kind of sus, like, they're suspicious to, in a sense, like parent all children, to feel responsible for all children, then there wouldn't be that kind of sense of starvation of that kind of contact and communion that leads to this sort of kind of bizarre resort to outsourcing. My friend visited a commune in Virginia and said that it was like a wonderful sort of shock to her system to witness children being kind of really like unclearly anybody's kid, and everybody, told the kid not to eat the rock. Like, obviously, I mean, right. Probably we would all tell it. I don't know. Would you? I mean, that's an interesting question. I was on the subway one time, and a very small person asked me whether I was a girl or a boy, because I had a buzzed head at the time, and I said, "I'm not actually sure. What do you think?" And they said, "A girl because of your dress and a boy because of your head." And I said, "And what about you?" And at that point, a parent, I think a mother, just absolutely freaked out and sort of removed the kid physically from my presence. But I think conversations with kids on subways should be mandatory.
Yeah, it's interesting because it is one of these licenses that I hadn't expected when I had a child, that it allowed me into a circle of societally being able to talk to children who weren't mine.
Yeah.
And really before that, there's certainly women have a little more, I think, are allotted, a bit more ability to do that without drawing a lot of skepticism, but even, as your example. But yeah, it's amazing how narrowly we keep that to really the advantage of no one. Mm-hmm. But it's now such a built up societal structure. Mm-hmm.
Okay, questions
Those
from
are
the
wonderful
room.
remarks.
So a few things. I couldn't help but see the analogy with slavery, surrogate parents with slavery, and that, with, the Americas, England, Spain, all these countries that participated in slavery in some respect came back to bite them, and then eventually people like in Jamaica now have this beautiful country and they're free from the history. But anyway, it seems really like it's going to be buried under a rock, and somebody like you is overturning the rock, because I had not known any of this occurred until hearing your talk tonight, and it was really pretty incredible. The other thing is, you mentioned at one point genetically that they've done something to be able to erase the background of the surrogate mother in the genes. Is that what I heard correctly from you?
Oh,
you showed an image of the connections of the, and it looked like you had little nicks in it or something like that.
Oh yeah. Sorry, it's quite strange if you're. It's actually quite simple. So traditional surrogacy is what they call implantation of an embryo that has used the surrogate's egg. And then gestational, I don't know why they call it that. It's all obviously gestational, but it's where there is no genetic material from her involved.
It rents the womb.
Yeah.
Rents the womb.
Yeah.
With the egg and the sperm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then there's a whole dimension of epigenetic impacts on the fetus. So I mean, I'm oversimplifying, and I'm also not, I mean, I'm a bit cringing to think what I might have got slightly wrong when Jean's a medical scholar. But, you know, I think there are, broadly speaking, you know, ideologies that compete here around authorship, you know. Is an embryo simply a kind of like a result of some program code that you put together with simply two sources, and then the you know, all these metaphors, the oven is just that, right? Just heat or just oxygen or whatever. And there's, you know, there are all kinds of other things to say about how it actually works. You know, Donna Haraway says that, I mean, this is a very provocative thought that I don't expect to understand anytime soon, but, you know, that reproduction doesn't really happen in our species because of the way that DNA doesn't actually sort of replicate in the process of sexuate reproduction. But epigenetics is interesting, and I'm sure much debated, and I'm sure people have quite wild and contested claims about how much goes on. But epigenetic means environmental, right? So regardless of what the genetic profile is of the thing that you're gestating, the fact that you are gestating it will make a difference. Will have an impact, will trace, and there will be, you know, there's all kinds of generational things that are being studied that can be passed on, generational traumas, generational exposures and risks. So it's not about tinkering to sort of cut something off. In fact, one of the points I kind of really want to insist on is that despite all the technological razzle-dazzle, you know, pregnancy is kind of pregnancy in a way. Like, it doesn't, the body doesn't discriminate very much about what embryo it gestates.
But the embryo, if it's conceived, or if the DNAs of the woman and the man are joined as an embryonic start, and then it's put into the womb, it has no history of the DNA of the surrogate. You know, so it's not carried by that, but it's just a rental flat.
But the DNA of any fetus is just as different.
Right.
No, seriously, that's an important point to understand.
Whether there's a portion of it or some partition
doesn't make a difference
because it's in the womb. In a growth manner.
Now, you know what this makes me think of is when we think about the transplanted uterus.
Yeah.
And the fact of that the woman's body or the person's body where the uterus has been transplanted, that she's very likely, she needs medication and whatnot, she's very likely to reject that organ, as happens with any transplanted organ. So she's got to have all sorts of medications. But any embryo that gets put into that organ, not a problem. That's just the basics of reproduction. Yeah. So whether I'm pregnant with an embryo that is half of my DNA combined with somebody's sperm, or
someone else's egg,
an egg that is my sister's egg, so it's kind of like me, or somebody completely unrelated to me, it makes no difference. Which is amazing. I mean, when you think about it, that again, it would make a big difference if it were, say, my sister's uterus transplanted into me versus somebody remotely not related to me at all. That would very unlikely be a good match. So,
I mean, looking ahead, say, 10 years out from here, lineage. It's a very important thing with certain families to document, to know their lineage of who they came from and going as far back as they can. And they pronounce this in countries if they have any kind of royal backing. But DNA, the genomics of an individual, the cost of that is coming down super fast. And I expect probably in 10 years, we'll all be able to have a code that we can understand where disease is coming from and various things like that. But these babies that are born through surrogacy or so would be able to know what their pathway is back if there's the surrogate mother or the implant, or there's some kind of trace of that in the genomics from the mother. I mean, it's kind of like, you know, adopted kids who don't know who their parents are, and when they get older, they want to meet their parents and go out and find that. But it will be, you know, but it will be uncovered in time, but it's just like a dirty secret now. You know, as you're describing, you know, what happens, like these couples want either a pet or a kid, you know, and they go to such extremes to go to, you know, as long as they can pay for it, they'll do it. Thank you for your talk tonight.
Thank you.
So once again, thank you for the wonderful lecture. There were a couple things that you said that really intrigued me and causes me to think further, just kind of like about the power dynamics and politics of this surrogacy, because when you're looking at people from the global north going to the global south to rent a home, you look at the politics of that, because why is that happening, that exchange happening? You know, there's a power imbalance, which is what kind of triggered my mind when you said if they would have the power to go knock on their doors and say, hey, you know, because you kind of have to be bold to do that. And I feel like that's triggers why that exchange is happening, because surrogacy can happen within any country you're in. To the best of my knowledge, I don't know any country where it's illegal, particularly in the global north too.
Oh, it's illegal in most states in the US and in the UK and in a lot of countries in Europe. It's also, sorry to interrupt, it's often 10 times more expensive to rent a California.
Oh, that's my point.
surrogate.
That's exactly the point I'm getting at, because you're going to the global south because
Yes, it's a market.
It's more affordable, in quotes. And then the part that you're doing that because it's more affordable. You're doing that because I feel this could be me implying that in terms of the power play, there would be a less chance of this person knocking at your door to demand for some kind of interaction with the child in the future.
I was so pleased I found that quote by the surrogacy clinician, because it was so precise. She really said, you know, she's very brazen, and it's very kind of, she literally says, you know, the thing that people like about my clinic is, you know, my employees are not going to come knocking on their doors in Paris or whatever.
And that's not because they're not curious.
No.
That's because of the power dynamics that's going on over there. And then just kind of finally, just looking at it all in terms of, what's the word? Migration. When you point out, like, the fact that a child that was cooked in India or, you know, in Nepal comes over to Palestine, to what was the country you said, and can become Israel and become a citizen because the person, but someone from Palestine who's been in Israel can't be a citizen. So looking at all of that, it's just interesting. That's what I'm going to So thank you very much.
Thank you. Actually, I'll just quickly say that I was glad that slavery was mentioned, because one of the things in feminist anti-surrogacy discourse was actually an interesting conversation between Black feminists and white feminists who had differing assessments of how new these quote unquote new reproductive technologies really were in the American context. So I think it was in the mid-80s, a big surrogacy case caused a huge, and this is traditional surrogacy, so the egg and, you know, belonged to the surrogate, so it was half of her genetics. You know, she changed her mind. There was a Supreme Court case about it. There was the Coalition Against Surrogacy was founded, and a lot of radical feminists of the sort of 80s variant, broadly speaking, my least favorite of all the feminisms, did a lot of very sort of apocalyptic discourse about the slavery. They didn't mind using that word, that these poor women were being subjected to. So they would have long lists of women, often white, Latina, sort of lower middle class, working class, who they didn't always bother to ask whether they felt they were indeed sort of enslaved by this economic transaction. And then people like actually Angela Davis even wrote back against this and said, look, not to say that the emerging industry in gestational labor is all great, far from it, but it's not as sort of new and spectacularly frightening in that sense to us as it clearly is to you, because Black women were, in a very real sense, surrogates on the plantation, given that it was precisely the ownership relation of motherhood that was not granted to them, right, when they gave birth. Yeah, there's there's still a lot of tension between feminists who want to create a real exception around surrogacy as a kind of work that women should never do, and others who argue, and I'm in this camp really, that the industry is terrible, and so are very many industries, and the way to address industries being terrible is to work sort of in and against them, in solidarity with and led by the people who are actually doing that work, and listening to their horizons and their immediate demands and needs, and not sort of moralizing over their heads in the thought that criminalizing something or morally mandating it out of existence actually does anything to change the fact that things we would not like to have commodified are commodified, and that's where we are at in the present. And those sorts of humanitarian mechanisms literally have been demonstrated to not do anything for the people who need it. I hope that was relevant.
One of the things it makes me think of is just going back to the organ issue, the organ transplantation, is just the international market for organs. And you sort of feel like when you do a kind of compare and contrast there, part of where I feel, because I was just thinking as you were talking, would a better solution be to say all these countries, wealthy countries that have good rules of law and that sort of thing, should figure out a way to open this back up and get the rules right around it, like have the workers, contribute to, rather than just making it illegal in the UK or in the US. But it's still because that is what we have as far as organ transplants go. The vast majority of folks, even if they could afford to go to get an organ from another country, okay, where you could buy and sell organs, they don't do it. They continue on the wait list in the country where they reside. Well, there's a few reasons. I mean, you can't bring the organ here. It's not going to wait that long. You have to be in that country. And so it's like that you as the individual have something on the line, where here it's that, at least I think it's the perception for the couples, that they're not sacrificing anything. I mean, I think for any of us to imagine undergoing a kidney transplant, terrifying enough in a place where we understand how the medical system works, but to imagine having that done in India, people do it, but it's not like, oh, well, if it were illegal in the US, that it would just be go to the, lowest common denominator. Anyway, I don't know if that makes sense at all, but just that it's like, no, we figured out a way to make it, it's not a commercial entity here, so it's not like it's a market, and people continue to then utilize the system that we have here rather than going somewhere where they could get an organ faster, but it's because they would take on very real risks to do that. Where when they have a gestational surrogate in a poor country where there's no regulations, the only person taking on risk there is the surrogate, really. I mean, at least as far as physical risks, that the couple is not.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely, agree in a sense. And then I also have these sort of instincts that I've kind of come over time to sort of have to counterbalance and to sort of to remind us that there are other perspectives in this that we can attempt in solidarity to lean towards, if not adopt ourselves, because it is highly unlikely, I think, that, for instance, I don't want to speak for everyone in the room, but there's a sort of level of risk and injury to the sort of job of being a surrogate that makes it unlikely, I think, for most people to be enrolled or recruited into that. There are some kind of boutique surrogacy workers in quite privileged situations who have sort of a passion, for doing pregnancy and who have the very, very, very best health insurance. In fact, there are military wives who have the very, very, very best health insurance in the US and who use that health insurance to do pregnancy as a kind of boutique craft service while their husbands are on deployment. True story. It's a whole thing. But I also think the sort of bird's eye view of thinking about policy and should surrogacy happen, and it often means that we err towards the position of the commissioning parent and the consumer. And I'm not saying that these things are one for one, because they are not, but I think it's still useful to compare with the sex industry. I think we would want to talk about, at least I would want to talk about how to, give sex workers what they need to be safe, to be well, and sort of end of story, right? And I think talk about whether the sex industry should exist and whether, is less interesting to me typically, right? I would not typically go into that. And while I am interested in a sense in why and how baby making happens, right, and is wanted, and how much of it, I wonder if the two conversations need to be kept a tiny bit apart, right? Like the reality is people do come and try and hire gestational labor, as I call it. And so, I don't know if, do you see what I mean? I think there's two conversations. Like surrogates need, I think, a similar set of things as sex workers do, really. Certain kinds of, automatic access to things like healthcare, but most people in the US don't have that, right? I wonder if some of these logics, when we pull on them, sort of, bring us to the need for universal, socialized healthcare, and things like that, right? Which would, but I mean, I suppose it's all interconnected,
Well, it makes me feel like as long as it's so international and you're crossing these boundaries that have completely different laws from one place to another, it's like, you will have places where as they are in this clinic, as you had outlined, of where the women are housed, but could be you know, could certainly, there could be an argument to have them in a situation where everything that they do is quite closely monitored. I mean, I don't, you know.
Oh yeah, no, they
I
are
mean,
monitored. It's
so that
you know,
it's
shit.
almost an imprisonment in a way.
Yeah, I mean, you know, absolutely. And also, you know, have you heard about the way that Amazon warehouse workers are surveilled every second of their lives, right? Like, you know, surveillance
True.
is a really common part of jobs right now. And yeah, absolutely. Being a surrogate in Dr. Naina Patel's clinic involves surveillance, involves boredom. Yeah, it involves lots of things, you know. And there are really interesting things that some of them say about the craft that they bring to the gestating that they do, you know. So that's a part that's often missed in the treatments that are quite sensationalizing and that really want to sort of, you know, just cut straight to the most sort of weird and, you know, melodramatic and sentimental moments, and don't necessarily want to hear about how boring it is to be a surrogate worker and how they have kind of ideas that have developed over time in one clinic. So, you know, labor knowledge that is shared and developed and passed around about how, like, a French embryo needs a certain kind of approach, whereas like an Indian embryo, and like, you know, you eat certain kinds of food. If it's an Indian embryo, it will want spicy food and like stuff like that. And, you know, I think it's important to listen and to believe people when they say that this is a better job than most of the other available, or all of the other available shitty jobs, like crushing glass, garment labor, farm work. You know, some people in Naina Patel's clinic talked about having a holiday from their husband. And that is also quite picked up a lot in Western treatments, because as you know from my book, there's a sort of bizarre desire to see almost a sort of feminism in the, you know, the dormitory full of pregnant women who get to not do housework for 8 months. Ha ha ha. And, you know, it's kind of, it's really
It's a
complicated.
reality show in the making, right?
Yeah, and I think we need to be very suspicious of the way that this is presented for Western audiences to consume. And at the same time, there's a kernel of something there, I think, you know, that there are sort of ways in which certain kinds of work present opportunities to, you know, even just think, right? And reassess and maybe decide to divorce your husband. This has been documented, you know. I mean, yeah, but I think we need to kind of ask ourselves, is it right to always have a conversation about this thing, surrogacy, that doesn't include observations about just pregnancy as without any, you know, just normal family, you know, reproduction? Because what I am really interested in trying to do is sort of to blur that boundary and to show that, you know, that there are sort of technologies of assistance at work in all, you know, baby making in a sense, and that there are also relations of outsourcing and you know, stratification involved in a lot of reproduction, right? We have maids, I wish. Sorry, I don't wish. I think there's complicated politics around that. But, you know, in a class society, you know, people hire reproductive labor from lower, you know, strata of society. And that is something that, for instance, Kalindivora calls vital energy. It sounds kind of almost mystical, but it's quite a materialist analysis. She sort of charts how families that are in the upper classes and echelons of our society become recognized as actually more needy and deserving of care, and that becomes so it becomes really naturalized, as though certain kinds of families that look a certain way actually genuinely need more care than do others, right? And this has sort of been studied and documented, and so all of that kind of vital energy for Kalindivora just kind of like goes up, right, to the cream at the top of the cake. And at the same time, I also think it's important to not kind of, so this is really subtle, but often, especially sort of good progressive liberals, will talk about how awful it is that, I don't know, a Filipina mother leaves her children behind at home to come and look after, the children of someone on the Upper West Side of Manhattan or whatever. And, it's not to say, yes, it is sad, no, it isn't sad, yes, it is right, no, it isn't right. It is very much a symptom of capitalist, geopolitics. The nuance that this wonderful scholar Laura Briggs brings to it is that there's also something quite normative about the assumption that by hiring the Filipina lady, we are sort of tragically depriving, and this, here again, I'm adopting the perspective of the consumer. It's really interesting how easily one slips into it, right? But the discourse is from that perspective of like, oh, that kinship network in the Philippines is bereft of our lovely maid, who is part of our family. And actually, Laura Briggs goes, to the Philippines and talks to children whose mom, has left and gone to New York to work. And they're like, oh, well, we have other ways of, there are like all kinds of other mothers in our society. And, I wouldn't do the same thing if it was me, but it's totally cool. And she suggests that there's this kind of normative idea of family that also then leads us to judge other sort of situations as though we are also capable of destroying them, by virtue of removing their single mother figure. So that needs to be avoided too, if that makes sense, right? Like, yeah. I wonder if there are questions on the Zoom. Oh.
Already gone 25 minutes over.
Oh, really?
It's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.